The invitation arrived in a black envelope, sealed with crimson wax. The card inside was heavy, its edges embossed with gold, and the words were written in a script so elegant it felt ancient. You are cordially invited to an exclusive wine tasting event at Black Hollow Vineyard. Saturday, 8 p.m. Formal attire required. Black Hollow Vineyard. I'd heard the name whispered in wine circles, always in tones of awe or unease. It was legendary and reclusive, known for producing wines so exquisite that collectors would pay obscene amounts for a single bottle. But it wasn't just the quality that gave the vineyard its mystique. It was the secrecy. No one knew who owned it, and no one I knew had ever been there. Yet, here I was, holding an invitation. The card had no RSVP instructions, but when Saturday came, a sleek car appeared outside my apartment without warning. The driver, dressed in a dark suit, stepped out and opened the door. "Miss Evelyn," he said, his tone polite but clipped. "We've come to escort you." The drive was silent and disorienting. We left the city behind and wound through dark, twisting roads bordered by thick forests. The moon was a faint sliver in the sky, and the only light came from the car's headlights. After what felt like hours, the road opened into a wide clearing. Black Hollow Vineyard stretched before us, its rows of vines eerily symmetrical, disappearing into the darkness. Beyond them, a sprawling estate loomed, a mansion made of dark stone, its windows glowing faintly from within. As the car stopped, I noticed other guests arriving. They stepped out of cars as elegant as mine, their attire sharp and expensive. Despite their polished appearances, they moved with a strange stiffness, their faces too pale. The mansion doors were opened by a pair of attendants dressed in black. "Welcome," one of them said, their voices smooth as polished glass. Inside, the air was cool and fragrant, carrying a faint, heady sweetness that made my head swim. The room was vast, its high ceilings adorned with chandeliers that glimmered like ice. A grand staircase wound upward, and at the center of the room stood a table laden with glasses of wine, their deep crimson hues catching the light. A woman greeted me, her dress flowing like liquid silver. She had dark eyes that seemed to pierce straight through me. "Miss Evelyn," she said, her smile revealing perfect, gleaming teeth. "We've been expecting you." "Thank you for the invitation," I said hesitantly. "The vineyard is beautiful." Her smile widened. "I think you'll find our offerings unforgettable. Please enjoy yourself." The wine was unlike anything I'd ever tasted. Each sip was a revelation, rich and complex, with notes I couldn't quite place. The flavors lingered on my tongue, growing stronger instead of fading, and a strange warmth spread through me. As I mingled with the other guests, I noticed something peculiar. No one seemed to drink as much as they held their glasses. They swirled the wine, admired its color, even raised it to their lips, but few actually sipped. A man in a sharp black suit approached me. He was older, with silver hair and piercing green eyes that seemed too bright. "First time at Black Hollow?" he asked, his voice smooth and low. "Yes, I admit it. It's incredible here." He chuckled softly. "It's a privilege, to be sure. But tell me, Miss Evelyn, have you noticed it yet?" "Noticed what?" I asked, frowning. His smile was thin. "There, the way it humps. The vines, how they seem to breathe. And the wine," he swirled the liquid in his glass, its deep red hue almost black in the dim light. "The wine does more than please the palate." I laughed nervously, thinking he was joking, but his gaze remained fixed, unblinking. "You'll see," he said cryptically, walking away before I could respond. Later in the evening, guests were invited for a tour of the vineyard. The moon had risen higher, casting the rows of vines in silvery light. As the group strolled along the dirt paths, our guide spoke of the vineyard's legacy, how its origins stretched back centuries, though no records of it could be found. "These vines are special," she said, running her fingers along a leaf. "They flourish where others would fail. Their roots run deep, deeper than you might imagine." As we walked, I began to notice it. The vines seemed to move. It was subtle at first, a slight rustle in the still air, a curl of a leaf where none had been before. But as I lingered at the back of the group, I saw it more clearly, tendrils that twisted toward us, their tips trembling as if tasting the air. When I stepped back, I felt something brush my ankle. Looking down, I saw a vine curling around my foot, its surface glistening with dew or something thicker. I kicked it away, my heart racing, but no one else seemed to notice. "We take great care in harvesting," the guide said, her voice drifting back to me. "Only the finest grapes are selected. And of course, the soil must be enriched. After the tour, we were invited to the cellar to taste the vineyard's most exclusive vintage. I wanted to leave. I was unnerved and dizzy, the wine sitting too heavily in my stomach. But something kept me there, a strange pull I couldn't explain. The cellar was vast and cold, lined with rows of barrels that seemed ancient. At the far end, a single bottle rested on a pedestal, its glass dark and unmarked. "This," the guide said, "is our rarest creation. It is not offered to just anyone." The guests leaned in eagerly as she poured a single glass, the liquid inside so dark it seemed to absorb the light. She passed it to me. "Miss Evelyn," she said, "would you do us the honor?" I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to refuse. But their eyes were on me, expectant, hungry. I took the glass, the liquid swirling thickly. The first sip was unlike anything I'd ever tasted. It was sweet and rich, but beneath it was something sharp, metallic. A wave of warmth surged through me, followed by a deep chill. And then I saw them. The faces. In the liquid, faint but unmistakable, were faces, their expressions twisted in agony. They swirled with the wine, their mouths opening in silent screams. I dropped the glass, its shatter echoing through the cellar. The guide's smile didn't falter. "Such a shame," she said softly, and the other guests began to close in, their movements too smooth, too deliberate. I turned and ran, weaving through the barrels as the whispers began. "Stay, stay, stay." The cellar stretched on forever, the air growing thicker, the ground beneath me soft and wet. At last, I found the staircase and bolted up, emerging into the cool night. The vineyard was alive. The vines writhed and twisted, their tendrils reaching for me. I sprinted through them, their tips brushing my arms, leaving streaks of something cold and slick. I didn't stop running until I reached the road, where a single car waited, its door open. I woke the next morning in my apartment, the black envelope on my nightstand. My clothes were stained with dark streaks, and my hands smelled faintly of wine. I've tried to throw the invitation away, but it always reappears. And at night, I hear whispers, soft and insistent. "Come back. It's your turn." I think the wine changed me. My reflection in the mirror doesn't always move when I do. And sometimes, late at night, I feel the phantom touch of vines curling around my ankles. They're waiting for me. And I'm afraid someday I'll go back. I was never much of a gym person, but after my breakup, I decided it was time to make a change. New habits, new me, or so I told myself. I signed up for a gym membership at Iron Haven Fitness, a 24-hour facility just a few blocks from my apartment. It wasn't anything fancy, but the place had decent reviews, and I figured the convenience of its always-open policy would keep me accountable. The first few visits were fine. I stuck to the basics, the treadmill, a few dumbbells, maybe the rowing machine if I was feeling adventurous. The gym was usually quiet late at night, which I preferred. But one evening, after a particularly rough day at work, I decided to hit the gym closer to midnight. That's when things started to get strange. When I arrived, the place seemed deserted. The front desk was empty, and the usual faint pop music playing over the speakers was absent, replaced by an unsettling silence. Still, my key fob worked, and the automatic doors slid open. I stepped inside, greeted by the familiar scent of rubber mats and faintly metallic air, though it seemed sharper tonight, almost coppery. The lights were dimmer than usual, casting long, distorted shadows over the equipment. For a moment, I hesitated, wondering if I should just head home. But I'd already changed into my workout gear, and I didn't want to waste the effort. I made my way to the treadmill. As I stepped on, the belt hummed to life, and I started my run. The rhythmic sound of my footsteps filled the empty space, comforting in its repetition. But as I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Iron Haven had a small studio room at the back, lined with mirrors from floor to ceiling. It was used for yoga classes and personal training sessions, but it was usually empty late at night. After finishing my run, I decided to stretch there. It felt less exposed than the main gym floor. The room was eerily quiet, the mirrors reflecting the dim light in strange, fragmented ways. As I stretched, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I froze and turned toward the mirrors. Nothing, just my reflection, slightly distorted by the angles of the glass. Shaking it off, I continued stretching. But then I saw it again, a flicker of movement behind me, just at the edge of the reflection. This time, I turned fast, my heart pounding. The room was empty. "Get a grip," I muttered, but my voice sounded small in the stillness. As I stood, ready to leave the room, I glanced at the mirror one last time. My reflection didn't move. It stood there, staring back at me, a faint, twisted smile curling its lips. Panicking, I bolted out of the mirror room and back to the main gym floor. My heart was racing, but I told myself I was imagining things. I just needed to finish my workout and get out of there. That's when I saw them. At first, they looked like normal gym-goers, 3 figures at the far end of the room, lifting weights. I hadn't noticed them when I came in, but I was so freaked out I hadn't exactly been paying attention. Relieved to see other people, I almost called out to them. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. They were moving in perfect synchronization. Every squat, every curl, every press. They moved as one, their motions mechanical and unrelenting. Their faces were pale, almost gray, and their eyes were hollow, empty pits. I stumbled backward, bumping into a weight rack. The sound echoed loudly in the silent gym. All 3 heads snapped toward me at once. I turned and ran toward the front desk, hoping to find the night manager or someone. Anyone who could explain what the hell was going on. Instead, I found the trainer. He was standing behind the desk, dressed in the gym's black and red uniform. I'd never seen him before, but that wasn't surprising. There were plenty of staff members I didn't know. What was surprising was the way he just stood there, completely still, his head slightly tilted as if listening to something I couldn't hear. "Hey," I said, my voice shaky. "Something weird is going on, I think." Before I could finish, he looked up. His eyes were black. Not just the irises, the entire eye was an inky void, as if someone had scooped them out and replaced them with darkness. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice flat and cold. I stepped back, my blood running ice cold. I was just leaving." "No," he said, stepping out from behind the desk. "You're not." I ran. I didn't look back, just ran. My sneakers squeaked against the polished floors as I darted between weight machines and cardio equipment, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Behind me, I heard the sound of footsteps, many footsteps, quick and deliberate, growing louder with each passing second. I glanced back and immediately regretted it. The trainer was chasing me, his movements unnaturally fast, his limbs jerking like a puppet on strings. Behind him, the 3 gym-goers followed, their empty eyes fixed on me, their synchronized movements somehow more terrifying than the trainer's erratic pursuit. I sprinted toward the exit, my only thought to get out. But when I reached the doors, they wouldn't budge. I slammed my hands against the glass, screaming for help, but the street outside was deserted. "You can't leave," the trainer's voice whispered, impossibly close. I turned to see him standing just a few feet away, his head tilted at that same unnatural angle. "The gym isn't done with you yet." The lights flickered, and the air grew heavy, almost suffocating. Behind the trainer, the machines were moving on their own. Treadmills ran without anyone on them. Weight stacks rose and fell rhythmically, the clanking of metal echoing through the space. A rowing machine twisted unnaturally, its handles snapping like jaws. I backed away, my mind screaming for an escape. My only option was the stairwell leading to the basement, where locker rooms and storage areas were. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than staying here. The basement was worse. The lights were dim and flickering, casting long, eerie shadows across the damp concrete walls. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and something else, something rotten. I could hear them upstairs, their footsteps echoing as they searched for me. I stumbled through the maze of lockers and utility rooms, my chest heaving, every muscle in my body screaming for rest. Then I saw it. At the far end of the corridor was a door I'd never noticed before, marked with a simple sign, "Staff only." I had no other choice. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was enormous, far too large to fit beneath the gym. Rows of strange, mechanical equipment lined the walls, humming softly. At the center of the room was a massive tank filled with a thick red liquid. Floating inside were bodies, dozens of them. My stomach churned as I recognized some of the faces. They were gym regulars, people I'd seen during my workouts. Their expressions were frozen in silent screams, their eyes wide with terror. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice came from behind me. I turned to see the trainer, his black eyes gleaming in the dim light. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "This is how we stay strong," he said, his lips curling into a cruel smile. "The gym thrives on effort, on energy. And when members stop coming," he gestured to the tank, "they join the system." I don't remember how I got out. One moment, I was backing away from the trainer. The next, I was on the street, gasping for air, the gym's dark windows staring at me like eyes. I didn't go back. I canceled my membership the next day, though the person on the phone acted like they didn't know who I was. But sometimes late at night, I hear it, the faint hum of a treadmill, the clink of weights. And in my dreams, I see the trainer, his black eyes boring into mine. They're waiting for me to come back, and I'm afraid someday I might. The job posting felt like a lifeline. I'd been unemployed for 6 months after a series of layoffs hit my industry, and my savings were down to ramen noodle levels. So when Midline Solutions reached out about a job as a corporate data analyst, I jumped at the chance. The office was downtown, housed in one of those mirrored skyscrapers that reflected the clouds so perfectly it seemed to vanish against the sky. The hiring manager called me back the day after my interview. I didn't even negotiate. I just said yes. The strangeness started on my first day. I arrived 15 minutes early, wanting to make a good impression. The lobby was quiet, too quiet for a building this size. The air smelled faintly metallic, like old pennies. A receptionist behind a glossy black desk looked up at me with glassy eyes and a too-wide smile. "Welcome to Midline Solutions," she said, voice syrupy and slow, like it was rehearsed. "You'll be working on floor 14. Please take elevator 3. I nodded and thanked her, though her demeanor left me unsettled. There were 4 elevators in the lobby, but I noticed elevator 3 looked off. Its brushed steel doors were marred with smudges, and the digital panel above it flickered faintly, struggling to hold the number display steady. I pressed the button, and the doors opened immediately, revealing an empty car. As I stepped inside, I caught the faintest whiff of something unpleasant, stale and sour, like wet carpet left to mildew. Before I could step back out, the doors shut with a metallic clang, sealing me in. The ride up was oddly long. The glowing numbers above the door crawled upward. 2, 3. For each one accompanied by a hollow ding that seemed to echo inside the elevator shaft. When I reached floor 14, the elevator let out a particularly sharp ding and shuddered to a stop. The doors slid open to reveal a dimly lit corridor. I stepped out and was greeted by silence. The office itself was sleek, all glass and steel with rows of identical cubicles. My new coworkers offered polite but muted greetings, their smiles fleeting and their eyes a bit too hollow. I noticed something odd. Everyone kept glancing at the far end of the room, toward a frosted glass door labeled Room 7. The door was locked, and no one ever seemed to go in or out. By lunchtime, I'd already noticed a few other odd quirks about the office. The fluorescent lights flickered sporadically, casting strange shadows that seemed to linger just a second too long. The air vents hummed, but the sound wasn't steady. It almost sounded like whispering. Once, when I leaned down to pick up a dropped pen, I swear I heard my name whispered faintly, just above the hum. I made it a point to ask Olivia, the coworker seated in the next cubicle over, about Room 7. She stiffened immediately, her fingers hovering mid-typing. "Don't worry about it," she said, not meeting my eyes. Her response only made me more curious. Later that afternoon, I was inputting data into a spreadsheet when the power suddenly went out. Everything shut down, the computers, the lights, even the hum of the air vents. For a moment, the office was submerged in complete darkness. Then, in the silence, I heard footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud against the carpeted floor. The sound came from the direction of Room 7, moving closer and closer. "Hello," I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, waiting. The darkness seemed to press against me, heavy and suffocating. Then, just as abruptly as it had gone out, the power returned. The fluorescent lights buzzed back to life, revealing an empty office, except a not quite empty. The door to Room 7 was ajar, but just barely. A sliver of shadow cut into the sterile light of the office. My heart pounded in my chest, a dull, thudding rhythm that drowned out the faint hum of the air vents. Did someone go in there? I muttered, more to myself than anyone else. I glanced around, but none of my coworkers seemed to notice. They were all glued to their monitors, heads bent low, typing furiously. No one reacted to the power outage, the sound of footsteps, or the now slightly open door. "Hey, Olivia," I whispered to the woman in the cubicle next to mine. She didn't respond. Her fingers clattered against the keyboard like a machine, typing lines of data into a spreadsheet. "Olivia," I tried again, louder this time. She froze, her hands hovering above the keys. Slowly, almost mechanically, she turned to look at me. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a tight line. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't look inside." Before I could ask her what she meant, she turned back to her monitor and resumed typing as if nothing had happened. Curiosity has always been my Achilles heel. I knew I should have let it go. I knew I should have just gone back to work like everyone else. But the door was calling to me. Not literally, it didn't whisper or hum like the air vents, but it felt alive somehow, like it was waiting for me to notice it. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor, and began walking toward room 7. The closer I got, the colder the air became. By the time I reached the door, I could see my breath puffing out in small, frosty clouds. My fingers trembled as I reached for the handle. The door creaked open an inch further, as if inviting me inside. The room beyond was pitch black, an inky void that seemed to swallow the light from the office behind me. I hesitated, glancing over my shoulder to see if anyone was watching. But my coworkers were still hunched over their desks, oblivious. I leaned forward, peering into the darkness. At first, I thought the room was empty. But then my eyes adjusted, and I saw something. In the center of the room stood a desk, an old wooden monstrosity that didn't match the sleek, modern aesthetic of the office. Papers were strewn across its surface, yellowed with age and curling at the edges. A single lamp sat on the desk, its bulb dim and flickering, casting weak light onto a small black notebook. I took a step inside. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, the air changed. The metallic smell from the lobby returned, stronger now, almost choking. The door slammed shut behind me, plunging the room into darkness. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking. No response. I fumbled for my phone, using the flashlight to illuminate the space. The beam of light swept across the desk, the notebook, and the walls. I froze when I saw the walls. They were covered in writing. Words, scrawled in frantic, looping handwriting, covered every inch of the walls, ceiling, and floor. Some were written in ink, others in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. I stepped closer, angling my flashlight to read the words. "Don't look. IT sees you. Get out while you can." The phrases repeated over and over, overlapping and tangling like a spiderweb of warnings. I turned my attention to the desk, drawn to the black notebook. Its cover was cracked leather, its edges worn and frayed. Against my better judgment, I reached out and opened it. The pages were filled with the same frantic handwriting as the walls. The first entry was dated 5 years ago. I don't know how long I've been here. The days blur together. The office won't let me leave. It feeds on us, on our fear, our stress. I can feel it watching me through the walls. Room 7 is the heart of it. If you're reading this, get out now. I flipped to another page, my hands trembling. I saw it today. The entity. It doesn't have a face, just a shifting void where its features should be. It whispered my name. It knows me. It knows all of us. It's in our heads, feeding on our thoughts. I think I'm becoming part of it. The final entry was scrawled so violently the pen had torn through the paper in places. It's too late for me, but maybe not for you. Destroy this room. Destroy the notebook. Don't let it win. As I finished reading, the air grew colder. The lamp on the desk flickered and went out, plunging the room into total darkness. And then I heard it. A voice, low and guttural, whispered my name. "Daniel." The voice sent ice down my spine. It wasn't just the sound of my name. It was the way it stretched, like fingers running over my thoughts. I dropped the notebook and spun around, but the room was pitch black. My phone's flashlight flickered and then died, leaving me in a suffocating void. "Daniel," the voice whispered again, closer this time. I stumbled backward, my shoulder colliding with the desk. My hands scrabbled against the wood, searching for anything at all to defend myself. The air around me felt alive, charged with something malevolent. And then I saw it. A shape emerged from the darkness, tall and angular. Its body seemed to shift and ripple, as though it was made of shadows stitched together. Where its face should have been was nothing, a void so deep it hurt to look at. My knees buckled, and I fell to the floor. "Why are you here?" it hissed. The words didn't come from its featureless head, but from the walls themselves, the sound reverberating like a chorus of whispers. "I didn't mean to," I stammered, my voice breaking. It tilted its head, as if considering me. "You open the door. You let me see you." Suddenly, the room felt smaller, the walls closing in. The writing on them glowed faintly now, pulsing like a heartbeat. What do you want?" I choked out. The thing crouched, bringing its void where its face should have been level with mine. "Stay," it said. "You'll stay. Like the others." The others. The word jolted me. My coworkers, they've been acting strangely all day, their movements mechanical, their eyes dull. I thought back to the receptionist in the lobby, her too-wide smile, her glassy gaze. Were they all trapped? "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "I'm not staying." The thing let out a sound that might have been laughter, low guttural rumble that made my skin crawl. "You already belong to me," it said. The walls shimmered, and suddenly, I wasn't alone in the room. Figures began to emerge from the darkness, their outlines faint but unmistakable. They were people, dozens of them, maybe more. Their faces were pale and empty, their eyes black pits. They moved slowly, shuffling toward me, their mouths opening and closing as if trying to speak. I recognized Olivia among them. "Help us," she mouthed, her voice a barely audible whisper beneath the growing hum in the room. I scrambled to my feet, panic surging through me. The desk. The notebook. The last entry, it said to destroy it. If this room was the heart of the entity, maybe it was the key to ending it. I lunged for the notebook, snatching it off the desk. The figures froze, their heads snapping toward me in unison. The entity let out a guttural roar, its shadowy form swelling and distorting. "You will not," it bellowed, the walls trembling with the force of its voice. I ignored the fear clawing at my chest and tore the notebook in half. The pages ripped easily, disintegrating into ash in my hands. The entity screamed, a sound so loud and piercing I thought my eardrums would burst. The glowing words on the walls began to fade, the figures dissolving into wisps of shadow. "No," it roared. "You cannot." The entity lunged at me, its arms stretching into jagged, claw-like tendrils. But as it reached me, its form began to break apart, shattering into shards of darkness that vanished into the air. The room began to collapse around me. The walls crumbled, revealing nothing but a swirling void beyond. I felt myself being pulled toward it, the force dragging me off my feet. "No, no, no." I screamed, clawing at the desk to hold on. The pull was too strong, and I felt myself slipping into the void. And then I was back. The light of the office blinded me, the hum of the air vent steady and comforting. I was lying on the floor just outside room 7. The door was shut, and the writing on the walls was gone. "Daniel." I looked up to see Olivia standing over me, her face no longer pale and hollow. She looked normal. Alive. Around us, the office buzzed with life, employees chatting, phones ringing, keyboards clacking. "Are you okay?" Olivia asked, helping me to my feet. I think so," I said, my voice shaky. I glanced toward room 7. The door was no longer frosted glass, but solid wood, unmarked and unremarkable. "It's over," Olivia said, following my gaze. "Whatever you did, it's gone now." I quit that job the next day. Midline Solutions dissolved a week later, the company inexplicably filing for bankruptcy. I didn't care to look into the details. Sometimes, though, I still dream about the office. I see the entity, its shifting void of a face, and hear the whispers calling my name. And sometimes, just before I wake, I hear the hum of the air vents, and I wonder if it's really gone. The storm came suddenly, fierce and unrelenting, blotting out the road in front of me. Sheets of rain lashed against my windshield as thunder growled overhead, a low, menacing sound that rattled in my chest. My car's headlights barely penetrated the gloom, illuminating a winding road framed by skeletal trees. My GPS had lost signal miles ago, leaving me to rely on an old printed map I'd stashed in the glove compartment, an artifact of my tendency to over-prepare. I was supposed to meet my friends at a lakeside cabin, a weekend getaway to celebrate my recent promotion. But now I wasn't even sure I was on the right road. The storm had knocked out cell service, and I'd passed no signs of civilization for nearly an hour. When I first saw the hotel, its shape looming against the hillside, I thought it was a trick of the light. The building was enormous, its facade a patchwork of stone and weathered wood, with steep gables and narrow windows that gleamed like shards of ice in the rain. A neon sign buzzed faintly above the entrance, Ashmere Inn. I hesitated, gripping the wheel. The place looked like it belonged in an old horror movie, the kind where the guests check in but never leave. But the rain was coming down harder now, the wind howling like a wounded animal. My car was low on gas, and I had no idea how far the next town might be. Sighing, I pulled into the gravel driveway. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a single rusted sedan parked near the entrance. As I stepped out of the car, clutching my jacket against the icy rain, I felt a strange pressure in the air, a heaviness that settled over me like a damp blanket. The lobby was eerily quiet. The interior was surprisingly grand, though it had the faded elegance of a place long past its prime. A chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals dulled with dust, and a massive fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold and empty. The air smelled faintly of mildew and something sweeter, like decaying flowers. Behind the reception desk stood a man in a burgundy vest and a too-perfect smile. His hair was slicked back, and his pale skin seemed almost luminous under the dim light. "Welcome to the Ashmere Inn," he said, his voice smooth and practiced. "You must be in need of shelter from the storm." I nodded, brushing rain from my sleeves. "Do you have a room available?" "Of course." He slid a leather-bound ledger across the desk, its pages yellowed and curling. "Please sign your name." I hesitated, glancing around the lobby. The place felt off. There were no other guests, no signs of staff bustling about, and the man's gaze was just a little too steady, as though he were studying me. But the storm raged outside, and I had no other options. "Sure," I said, scrawling my name in the ledger. "Room 313, he said, handing me an old-fashioned key attached to a brass tag. "Take the stairs to the third floor. Breakfast is served at 7 a.m. sharp." The staircase creaked under my weight as I ascended, the sound echoing through the empty halls. The wallpaper was peeling in places, revealing patches of damp plaster, and the light fixtures flickered weakly. By the time I reached room 313, I felt an inexplicable sense of dread. The door looked like all the others, scuffed wood, a tarnished brass number, but something about it made me pause. The air here was colder, and the faint scent of decay was stronger. Shaking off my unease, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was small but functional, with a single bed, a wardrobe, and a writing desk. A large mirror hung on one wall, its surface tarnished with age. The window rattled in its frame as the wind howled outside, and the rain drummed steadily against the glass. I dropped my bag on the bed and sank into the chair by the desk. My phone still had no signal, and the Wi-Fi password scrawled on a card by the bedside didn't seem to work. Frustrated, I decided to call it a night. But as I lay in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The sound came just as I was drifting off, a faint, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was the rain against the window. But as I lay there, heart pounding, I realized it was coming from the wardrobe. I sat up, my breath catching in my throat. The room was dark, save for a sliver of moonlight filtering through the curtains. The wardrobe stood in the corner, its doors slightly ajar. "Hello," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The tapping stopped. I waited, every muscle in my body tense. When nothing happened, I slid out of bed and crept toward the wardrobe, my bare feet silent against the floor. My hand trembled as I reached for the door handle. I yanked it open. The wardrobe was empty. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I turned back toward the bed, I caught a glimpse of movement in the mirror, a shadow darting across the room. I spun around, but the room was empty. The next morning, I headed to the dining room for breakfast. The receptionist's perfect smile greeted me as I passed the lobby, but there was no sign of other guests. The dining room was a cavernous space with high ceilings and long tables set with mismatched china. A single man sat near the far wall, hunched over a plate of eggs. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and bloodshot. "Rough night," I asked, sliding into a seat across from him. He didn't look up. You shouldn't have come here, he muttered, his voice hoarse. What do you mean? He glanced around, as if afraid someone might overhear. This place, it's wrong. People check in, but they don't check out. Before I could press him further, he stood abruptly, leaving his half-eaten breakfast behind. Back in the lobby, I found a stack of pamphlets detailing the history of the Ashmere Inn. The hotel had been built in the late 1800s as a retreat for wealthy travelers, but had fallen into disrepair after a series of mysterious deaths. Rumors of hauntings had plagued the inn for decades, and it had changed ownership several times, each new proprietor abandoning it after a few short years. The final entry in the pamphlet caught my eye. Warning, the Ashmere Inn is not liable for any unexplained occurrences or disappearances. Guests enter at their own risk. Over the next 2 days, the strange occurrences escalated. In the middle of the night, I would wake to the sound of footsteps pacing outside my door. Objects in my room shifted positions when I wasn't looking. A glass of water moved to the edge of the nightstand. A chair turned to face the mirror. And then there were the whispers. They started faint, barely audible, like the rustling of leaves. But each night, they grew louder until I could make out fragments of words. Help us. Get out. It's coming. On the third night, I decided I couldn't stay any longer. I packed my bag and headed for the lobby, determined to leave, storm or no storm. But the lobby was empty, and the front door wouldn't budge. Desperate, I wandered the halls, searching for another exit. That's when I found it, a hidden staircase behind a tattered curtain leading down into the basement. The air grew colder as I descended, the faint scent of decay growing stronger. The basement was a labyrinth of stone corridors, lit by flickering bulbs that cast long, eerie shadows. At the end of one corridor, I found a massive iron door. It was slightly ajar, and beyond it, I could hear the faint sound of chanting. I pushed the door open, revealing a cavernous room filled with robed figures standing in a circle. In the center of the circle was a gaping hole in the floor, its edges jagged and blackened as though it had been burned into the earth. The chanting stopped as the robed figures turned to look at me. Their faces were pale and expressionless, their eyes black pits. Before I could run, one of them stepped forward, pulling back his hood. It was the receptionist. Welcome, Daniel, he said, his too perfect smile widening into something unnatural. We've been waiting for you. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was stumbling through the rain, the Ashmere in a dark silhouette behind me. My car started on the first try, and I sped away, not daring to look back. When I reached the cabin, my friends were waiting for me, their faces etched with worry. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words wouldn't come. Later, I searched online for the Ashmere Inn, but found nothing. No records, no reviews, not even a location on the map. Sometimes, I wonder if it was all a dream. But at night, when the rain falls and the wind howls, I hear the whispers again. And I know the Ashmere Inn is still out there, waiting for its next guest. Retro gaming had been my thing for years. There was something special about it, plugging in a cartridge, hearing the nostalgic beep-boop of an 8-bit tune, losing myself in a world that didn't demand photorealism to captivate. It wasn't just the games, it was the hunt. Scouring flea markets, thrift stores, and sketchy online forums for hidden treasures gave me a thrill that few other things could. On most weekends, I'd spend hours driving around town, hopping from one dusty shop to another, looking for the next rare find. That Saturday was no different. I had started the day optimistic, but after 4 flea markets and 1 disappointing garage sale, my backpack was still empty. It was mid-afternoon when I stumbled upon the little market tucked behind an abandoned gas station. This wasn't your typical spot. There were no cheerful vendors or rows of neatly arranged tables. This market was grungy, grimy, and oddly quiet. A sense of unease settled over me as I wandered through the stalls, but I pushed it aside. These were often the places where you found the real gems. That's when I saw it. The booth was almost hidden, crammed into the farthest corner. Its lone occupant was a wiry man with hollow eyes and a cigarette dangling from his lips. His table was piled high with random junk, rusty tools, old videotapes, and a modest collection of game cartridges. One cartridge immediately caught my attention. It was black, devoid of any branding or art, with the word broadcast carved into the plastic in jagged letters. The carving wasn't neat. It looked rushed, almost desperate. "How much for this one?" I asked, holding it up. The man squinted at me like he was sizing me up. $5, he muttered. "It's busted, though." I handed him the money without hesitation. Something about the cartridge called to me. I didn't even wait until I got home. I had my old portable console with me, a battered but reliable device I used to test games on the go. Sliding the cartridge into the slot, I powered it on. The screen flickered to life with a hiss of static. The title screen appeared. Asterisk, Channel 51. Asterisk, the graphics were crude, even by retro standards, just blocky white letters on a black background. Beneath the title, two options blinked: Tune in and Sign Off. Curiosity burned through me. I selected Tune in. The screen buzzed, then shifted to a pixelated image of a man in a suit. He stood in what looked like an old TV studio. His face was an indistinct blur, as though the pixels couldn't quite align. A text box appeared below him. Asterisk, "Welcome to the show. Will you continue?" Asterisk. I pressed yes. The game began with a character, just a small pixelated figure, standing in the middle of a city. The graphics were crude, with gray buildings and dark streets that stretched endlessly in all directions. A few lamps flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows that seemed to shift and move on their own. The music was odd. It was a low, droning hum, punctuated by occasional bursts of static. The atmosphere was oppressive, but I was hooked. The city was labyrinthine, a maze of repeating textures and looping paths. As I wandered, I noticed strange details. Posters on the walls with phrases like "Eyes up" and asterisk, "Stay tuned." Asterisk. Sometimes, shadowy figures would flicker at the edges of the screen, too fast to catch. About 20 minutes in, I found a locked door. When I tried to open it, a text box appeared. Asterisk. "Adjust your TV settings to proceed." Asterisk. At first, I thought it was a glitch. I fiddled with the in-game menu, but nothing happened. Then it dawned on me. It meant the actual TV. I turned up the brightness on my portable console. As I did, a hidden pathway appeared on the screen, glowing faintly in the shadows. My heart raced. The further I went, the stranger the game became. The shadows moved in unnatural ways, stretching and flickering as though they had a will of their own. Occasionally, I'd hear faint whispers in the music, just beneath the static. Then the suited man returned. His blurred face filled the screen. "You're doing well," the text box read. "Don't stop now." When I got home, I transferred the cartridge to my main console and booted it up. This time, the game was different. The city was darker, the streets emptier. A soft wind howled in the background, carrying with it faint, indecipherable voices. As I moved my character through the twisting streets, I began to notice patterns. The graffiti on the walls wasn't random. It formed strange symbols, spirals, eyes, and jagged lines that seemed to pulse if I stared too long. The shadows grew bolder. They no longer flickered at the edges of the screen. Now they reached for my character, their hands outstretched. Touching one didn't result in a game over. Instead, the screen would flash with distorted images, screaming faces, empty eyes, static-riddled landscapes. The game began to address me directly. Asterisk. "Are you ready, Alex?" Asterisk, the text box asked. I froze. I hadn't entered my name anywhere. That night, I dreamed of the city. The streets stretched endlessly, the shadows whispered my name, and the suited man stood in the distance, watching. When I woke up, I felt off. My apartment was silent, but there was an unnatural weight in the air, like the hum of an old TV left on in another room. I went to the living room and froze. The TV was on, displaying static. I was certain I'd turned it off before going to bed. Then I saw my reflection in the screen. It wasn't quite right. My face was there, but my eyes were too dark, my mouth twisted into a faint, unnatural grin. I turned off the TV and went back to bed, but the feeling of being watched never left. The game escalated. My character found a tall tower in the middle of the city, a monolithic structure that seemed to pulse with static. At the top of the tower was a door, glowing faintly. When I entered, the screen dissolved into static, and I was taken to a new area, the control room. It was massive, filled with rows of CRT monitors, each one displaying a different scene. Some showed people sitting in their homes, staring at their TVs. Others showed empty streets or rooms filled with flickering shadows. One monitor showed me. I was sitting on my couch, controller in hand, staring blankly at the screen. My stomach churned as I realized that I wasn't just playing the game. I was being watched. The suited man appeared beside me, his face more distinct than ever. His smile was wide and cold. "You've made it far," he said. "But the signal must grow." I couldn't stop playing. Even when I wasn't in front of the console, the game haunted me. I began researching the name Channel 51, digging through obscure forums and old archives. What I found chilled me to the bone. Channel 51 was a myth, a ghost story passed around by conspiracy theorists. It was said to be a rogue broadcast station that aired strange, indecipherable signals during the late 1980s. Viewers reported seeing disturbing imagery, faceless figures, endless static, and cryptic messages. Some claimed that watching too long caused hallucinations, paranoia, even insanity. The station had supposedly been shut down in 1990, but the rumors persisted. Some believed that its signal had never truly died, that it had found new ways to spread, infecting people through games, videos, even the internet. The game began leaking into my reality. I'd see flashes of the suited man in mirrors, his blurred face appearing for just a second before vanishing. My phone started glitching, displaying static instead of my lock screen. One night, as I sat in the dark, I heard a voice coming from the TV. "Alex," it whispered. "It's almost time." I didn't dare turn around. The game's climax was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. My character stood before the control room's central monitor, where the suited man waited. "It's time to strengthen the signal," he said. Two options appeared: strengthen the signal or let it die. If I chose to let it die, the screen warned. Everything connected to it would vanish, including me. Terrified, I chose to strengthen the signal. The screen flickered, and I was no longer in my living room. I was in the control room, surrounded by monitors. "You've done well," the suited man said. "But the broadcast must continue. Now, I'm part of the signal." Every night, the game spreads to new homes, new players. A black cartridge appears, and someone else tunes in. If you ever find it, don't play it. Don't even touch it. Because once you tune in, you'll never tune out.